Hello, and thanks for hitting play. I'm Professor Leonard Finkelman, recording from Linfield University. And today, we're going to learn about Baby Yoda's natural history. If I'm being honest, though, that's not really what I want to talk about in this presentation. Rather, my goal is to teach you a bit about the philosophy and science of comparative biology. Comparative biology is one of the important methods that I use in my work as a paleontologist, and it has deep roots in philosophical reasoning. So let's get to it. We currently live in a period of civil unrest. Across the planet Earth, humans struggle to bridge deep political and cultural divisions. In the midst of this strife, a new hope for unity arose in November 2019. That hope was Baby Yoda, whose debut in the Disney Plus Star Wars series The Mandalorian inspired universal adoration. Among Star Wars fans such as myself, Baby Yoda, officially called the asset or the child, inspired not only adoration, but also shock. Information about the species to which the child and the Jedi Master Yoda both belong remains the most closely guarded secret in all of Star Wars lore. I can tell you the employment history of the trainer for Jabba the Hutt's Rancor monster. He used to work for a circus, but I can't tell you much of anything about Yoda's species. Part of the reason for this ignorance is that George Lucas forbade creators from elaborating on Yoda's origins and relations. For example, in 1994, the company Topps produced a series of trading cards that included this art depicting members of Yoda's species engaged in a hypothetical religious ritual. However, Lucas ordered the cards recalled and pulped before they could be distributed. We don't know much about Yoda, or about the child of the same species, because the character's creator worked to keep us in the dark about their species. There's an important similarity here with the work that paleontologists do. As we try to reconstruct Earth's past, we're hindered by an accumulated loss of information over geological time. Nature itself works to keep us in the dark through death, decay, and the destruction of fossils by natural processes. Luckily, paleontologists have a variety of tools that help to light the way in reconstructing the past. Among these tools is a method called comparative biology, which has its roots in basic philosophical reasoning. Just as a paleontologist can use comparative biology to reconstruct Earth's past, we can use the same tool to reconstruct the origins of adorable aliens from a galaxy far, far away. To accomplish this task, we'll start by examining the basic concepts and logic that form the basis of work in comparative biology. We'll then consider how comparative biology itself works, using a couple of examples as a model for our final goal, which is to learn about the natural history of Baby Yoda's species. Before we start, however, I should clear something up. While I work in paleontology, my original training was in philosophy of science, and whenever I give a presentation like this one, I think it's important to correct a popular misconception of how philosophy works. It's common for people to think that philosophers collect their paychecks by closing their eyes tight, thinking really hard, and imagining clever things to say. But this is pretty far from the truth. In reality, philosophical analysis is rigorous, structured, and tightly constrained by rules of logic. The word logic tends to get tossed around pretty freely these days, so let me define the word as philosophers use it. Logic is a study of recurring patterns in language and thought. These patterns take a variety of forms, some of which are better than others. One of the goals of philosophy is to figure out which forms work best and how they can be used to solve persistent problems. The first time American students are asked to think explicitly about logic itself tends to be during preparation for the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT. That exam includes a section with questions like the following. Darth Vader is to Luke Skywalker as Han Solo is to which other character? The question is asking us to recognize the relation between two known examples and then to apply that relation to find an unknown example. We know that Darth Vader is father to Luke Skywalker, so we answer the question by recognizing that Han Solo is father to Kylo Ren. This form of logic is called analogical reasoning. I'll define analogical reasoning as the transfer of information from known examples to unknown examples through some point of connection. In this case, the point of connection is the relation of fatherhood between characters. Analogical reasoning appears on the SAT because it's a form of logic that we use every day. We use analogical reasoning when we try new foods or when we pick new entertainment to consume. It normally goes like this. I know how I've reacted to past examples, and this new example is kind of like those older ones. So I'll probably have the same reaction to the new example that I did to the older ones. Given how many of our choices depend on analogical reasoning of this kind, it's important that we get it right. The key to good analogical reasoning is in the strength of the point of connection between examples. When the connection is strong, our reasoning is strong too. When the connection is weak, then our reasoning is prone to error. Example. When planning an assault on the planet-sized superweapon Starkiller base in Star Wars Episode VII The Force Awakens, Han Solo suggests that there must be a way to blow it up, given his previous experience with the planet-sized superweapon, the Death Star. This is good analogical reasoning. The similarities between the Death Star and Starkiller base are strong ones, right down to the way they're constructed. By contrast, we might try to draw a connection between Baby Yoda and the other most recent addition to Star Wars canon of cuties, the Porgs. Both of these are very small animals with flappy appendages. The Porgs can fly. Can we conclude that Baby Yoda can do the same? Of course not. The connection between the two is really weak and tenuous, especially when you realize that the Porg's flappy appendages are wings and Baby Yoda's are ears. Bad analogical reasoning proceeds from weak connections of this kind. With all this in mind, let's try to imagine ourselves in the position of an 18th century geologist. As we stroll the European countryside, we find some strange-looking rocks, which upon closer inspection look like bones. These bones don't look like any living animal, however, and such is the case with this fossil, named Pterodactylus. Just what the heck is this thing? If we want to learn about this unknown animal, then we're going to have to make use of information that we can gather from animals that we do know about. This was a key insight shared by thinkers such as Edward Tyson from Britain and Georges Cuvier from France. Tyson and Cuvier conducted thorough, detailed examinations of familiar animals so that they could hypothesize about newly discovered ones. This is the method of comparative biology, which is really just analogical reasoning applied to biological structures. Without the transfer of information from familiar animals to unfamiliar ones, we wouldn't be able to know very much at all about extinct species. With that in mind, let's look again at Pterodactylus. This is a small animal, not much larger than the image on your computer screen right now. One of the most striking features of the fossil is the animal's greatly elongated pinky finger. Other fossils from the same species showed that a skin membrane stretched between that finger and the animal's body. Among living animals, we find similar structures in bats, which fly using wings made of skin membranes stretched between their greatly elongated fingers. It's for this reason that some paleontologists initially reconstructed Pterodactylus as very bat-like. The point of connection here is an example of what biologists call analogy. It's true that we've been talking about analogies throughout this presentation, but biologists use the word in a special technical sense, meaning similarity in function. To learn about Pterodactylus from information that we gather about bats, we would have to imagine that Pterodactylus used its elongated fingers in the same way that bats use theirs, because structures with similar functions tend to have similar shapes. But is this the right connection to draw? Starting in 1859, biologists started to use another basis for comparative anatomy thanks to the work of Charles Darwin. In his book, On the Origin of Species, Darwin argued that all organisms are related by common ancestry. As we trace our family trees back far enough, through the eons of geological time, we'll find more and more ancestors who also left descendants in other closely related species. That idea is captured in this figure, which shows Darwin's evolutionary tree. Species represented at the top trace down through time to common ancestors at the bottom. If common ancestry is our point of connection between Pterodactylus and living organisms, then we would draw very different conclusions about how the animal lived. Pterodactylus was a flying reptile, although not a dinosaur. It was, however, about as close as you could get to being a dinosaur without being an actual dinosaur. In any event, its closest living relatives are birds. Looking at the fossil again, we might think that the elongated snout looks a lot like a bird's beak. Taking common ancestry as a point of connection, we might therefore reconstruct the animal as much more bird-like. This point of connection is an example of what biologists call homology, or similarity in origin. The snout of Pterodactylus and the beaks of birds have the same origins, both in evolutionary history and in embryonic development. This kind of connection is incredibly useful for reconstructing the path that evolution took in shaping life on Earth. It would be incorrect to say that homology or analogy is a stronger kind of connection in comparative biology. Each can be useful, and the best inferences are the ones we draw from structures that are both analogous in the biological sense of the word and also homologous. When we consider the balance of information drawn from analogies and information drawn from homologies, we're practicing natural history. Natural history is the study of an organism's place in ecology and evolutionary history. Paleontologists have gotten quite adept at practicing natural history in the past couple of hundred years. They're now so good at it that one can take a single isolated tooth, like this molar here, and use it to reconstruct an entire animal. This example is a favorite of my colleague Adrian Curry, whose book about philosophy of paleontology titled Rock, Bone, and Ruin is one that I strongly recommend. The tooth comes from a giant member of the platypus family named Obdurodon, which is known only from this one tooth. In fact, you'd be shocked by how many fossil species are known only from a single scrap of bone. But so powerful is the tool of comparative biology that even with a single scrap of bone, paleontologists can reconstruct not only an entire animal, but sometimes even an entire ecosystem. By comparison, we have a lot more information about Yoda and the child, but let's start examining them in the same place. Here's the clearest screenshot I could find that shows Yoda's teeth. What can those teeth tell us about Yoda's species? The teeth themselves look a bit sharper than human teeth, if kind of blunt, and they're peg-like, meaning that they don't seem to have any cusps like our teeth do. Are there any living animals with teeth like that? It turns out that we can find a pretty close match. The harbor porpoise, pictured here, has similarly blunt, peg-like teeth. The harbor porpoise is an aquatic predator. It uses its teeth to catch and eat small fish. Other animals that eat fish, like the sperm whale, shown here, or the Nile crocodile, shown here, also tend to have peg-like teeth because peg-like teeth are very good for holding onto small, squirmy, slippery prey. Yoda's teeth probably have the same developmental origin as the teeth of these aquatic predators, and he definitely uses them for the same purpose, which is eating. So these teeth are both homologous and analogous. We can therefore predict with some confidence that Yoda's species probably ate small, squirmy, slippery prey, just as Earth's aquatic predators do. And if you need a demonstration of comparative biology's power as a tool for making predictions about newly discovered animals, then I suggest you turn to the second episode of The Mandalorian. In that episode, Baby Yoda beautifully confirms our prediction by hunting and eating frogs. For the rest of this presentation, I'll consider 3 more clues to Baby Yoda's natural history. First, we'll see what we can learn about the species from Baby Yoda's size. Next, we'll see what we can learn from allometry, or the study of relative sizes of different body parts in comparison to one another. Finally, we'll think about ontogeny, or the growth of the organism from a baby to a mature adult. As I said earlier, Darwin showed that it really helps to have an understanding of evolutionary history when trying to learn about a newly discovered organism. And luckily, I can help here. I analyzed the anatomical features of several dozen different Star Wars aliens to produce this evolutionary tree, which shows the hypothetical relations of common ancestry between those aliens. Among other things, this evolutionary tree shows us that Yoda's species has its most recent common ancestor with aliens from Return of the Jedi's forest moon of Endor. Among these aliens with which Yoda shares a recent common ancestor, highlighted on the green branch here, are the Ewoks, which is probably an interesting point from a marketing perspective, just think of the toys. More directly relevant to our current goals, however, is the fact that Yoda's species also shares a recent common ancestor with the Gorax. The Gorax is a species of gigantic trolls that hunt Ewoks in the spin-off movie titled Caravan of Courage. A quick glance shows us that some important similarities between the Gorax and Baby Yoda are pretty clear. They have the same big ears, the same numbers of fingers and toes. But there's an obvious and really important difference between the two, and that is in their sizes. The Gorax is huge, and Baby Yoda is tiny. Are there any groups of animals on Earth that have both huge and tiny representatives? As it turns out, gigantic animals pretty frequently do have tiny counterparts. Hippos, which form one of our standards for hugeness, also come in a tiny variety. So did mammoths. In fact, there were several different species of dwarf mammoth around the world. Even the biggest land animals in Earth's history, the sauropod dinosaurs, had tiny species among their number. While everyone now knows the humongous Brachiosaurus from Jurassic Park, fewer people are familiar with the relatively pint-sized Europasaurus, which was only slightly taller than a human being. As it turns out, all of these dwarfed giants have an interesting point in common. They're all found on islands. This is a feature of ecology called insular dwarfism, and it's fairly common. When a large species colonizes a relatively small island, smaller members of the species tend to be more successful at exploiting the island's resources, and so the average size of the species members will tend to decrease over time. We already know that Yoda's species has a diet like at least a semi-aquatic predator, and so it's a good bet that the species got so small as a result of insular dwarfism as well. While members of Yoda's species tend to be small, their ears are not. And this can also give us some insight into the species' natural history, because we can find animals on Earth that also have relatively large ears. African elephants are the most obvious example, but a closer match to Baby Yoda might be the fennec fox from the Saharan desert. The gigantic elephant and the diminutive fox might be very different animals, but their oversized ears both perform the same function, which is to keep the animal cool. This works because the ears, which are relatively thin anatomical structures, are filled with blood vessels. And this exposes large volumes of blood to the air, which tends to be cooler than the interior of the animal's body. It's for this reason that animals adapted for warm weather climates, such as those of the African plains or the Saharan desert, tend to have anatomical features that are exaggerated relative to other body parts. We might infer then that Baby Yoda also has relatively large ears as an adaptation to warm weather climates. Finally, we can infer a surprising amount of information about Baby Yoda's natural history from its age. The Mandalorian is initially shocked to find that his 50-year-old bounty is a child, but he'd probably be less shocked if he knew that members of the species live for hundreds of years. However, even knowing that Yoda lived to the ripe old age of 900, Baby Yoda is still surprisingly young for its age. If we work out the math, then members of Yoda's species ought to age at a rate about 10 times greater than human beings. But if so, then Baby Yoda should have left its toddler phase at the age of 40, a good 10 years before the Mandalorian meets it. Some fans have taken this to be an inconsistency, or perhaps some clue as to some kind of misdirection on Baby Yoda's part. But it could also be valuable information about natural history. What can we learn from species on the planet Earth that also have long childhoods? Turns out that humans are weird in a number of ways, but perhaps for no greater reason than because of our development through childhood. Luckily, I didn't have to look further than the crib beside me for a perfect example of a human baby pictured here. A human baby's anatomy, when it emerges from the womb, is at a developmental stage comparable to much younger fetuses in other species. Even when we consider childhood, chimps and gorillas, which are our closest evolutionary relations, finish their development to anatomical maturity within the first decade of life, a period during which humans are still children. The animals whose anatomies develop to maturity at rates most similar to humans are probably elephants and whales. Both of these animals have young that retain anatomical proportions for juveniles for more than 10 years. While that might be explained by the relatively large sizes of the animals involved, there's another point in common to humans, elephants, and whales that goes some way towards explaining our long childhoods. Groups of animals in these species are all socially dependent. The length of childhood in animals tends to correlate with the extensiveness of parental care. Animals that can get more care from a wider variety of relatives have the luxury of enjoying longer childhoods. And this in turn gives us information about Baby Yoda's species beyond the child's own anatomy. the population of the species must be sufficiently large and dense that social interactions could be facilitated. After all, if your aunts, uncles, cousins, and other distant relations all help you for long enough that you can enjoy a long childhood, then all of those relations have to be pretty close at hand to help. Baby Yoda's species is therefore probably pretty sizable in terms of population numbers, and those population numbers are probably somewhat densely packed in its ecosystem. As the first season of The Mandalorian ends, the titular bounty hunter takes on the task of finding Baby Yoda's original home. Ironically, it's a tall order. The galaxy is large and contains a multitude of planets. Where should he even start? Well, now we can start to provide some answers. Using the methods that paleontologists use to reconstruct extinct forms of life, we can infer that Baby Yoda comes from a species of semi-aquatic predators. The species is likely a product of insular dwarfism, and it's adapted for warm weather. Members of the species are probably socially dependent on one another. The Mandalorian could do a lot worse than to start by looking for a large group of tiny predators packed onto an island in a tropical or subtropical climate. Of course, this could all be wrong, and Lord knows the show's second season wouldn't be very interesting if the answers were as simple to find as all that. And if I'm being entirely honest, this analysis probably wouldn't make it through peer review, and that's fine for the purposes of demonstration, but it's important to recognize where there may be flaws in the reasoning we've used. As I said earlier, we use analogical reasoning all the time, so it's important to guard against the potential sources of error in analogical reasoning. To do that, I would have to ask 3 questions about the analogies I've drawn between Baby Yoda and species on the planet Earth. And indeed, asking these questions is a good way to improve all analogical reasoning. The first question is, what are the differences between our given examples, and are those differences relevant? For example, all of Earth's island dwarfs live on the same planet as their larger counterparts, but that's not the case for Baby Yoda and the Gorax of Endor. That might be a pretty important difference, and a more complete argument would require me to explain why it does or doesn't matter. The second question is, how strong is the point of connection between examples? Is comparing Baby Yoda to, say, a fennec fox more like comparing Starkiller Base to the Death Star, or is it more like comparing Baby Yoda to porgs? As we saw in those examples, weaker points of connection leave us more vulnerable to error. Paleontologists can guard against those errors by finding analogies that are also homologies, but these concepts don't always apply to the kind of analogical reasoning we use in daily life. We must therefore choose the points of connection in the analogies that we draw very carefully. And that's what leads me to the final question, which is, could other examples have stronger points of connection than the ones we've identified? The philosopher David Lewis once said that we can find an infinite number of similarities and also an infinite number of dissimilarities between any 2 objects, as long as we try hard enough and split sufficiently many hairs. Sometimes we may think we've identified a strong enough point of connection between 2 examples, and so stop looking before we can find even stronger points of connection offered by other cases. This is a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. For example, bats also have big ears, but their ears are used for echolocation rather than temperature regulation. Maybe Baby Yoda can echolocate. However, I've never seen Baby Yoda engage in any behavior that looks like echolocation, and so I just wasn't looking for any species from the planet Earth that engage in that behavior. And so when I found an example of other animals that have big ears, I was satisfied with the connection that Baby Yoda could draw with those. But until we can rule out the possibility that Baby Yoda is capable of echolocation, my conclusions are open to objection. Raising that objection is an exercise that I leave to you, as is the exercise of reconstructing the natural histories of other Star Wars aliens. These kinds of exercise may seem kind of trivial, especially given the situation that we currently find ourselves in. But it's important to remember that our capacity for logical thinking is like a muscle. The more we exercise it, the better it works. And so, thinking hard about the denizens of a galaxy far, far away, however cute they may be, is just as good as hitting the gym. Thanks very much for your time. Please don't hesitate to contact me at dinosaurphilosophy@linfield.edu or to check out my other work at dinosaurphilosophy.org. Stay safe, stay healthy, and keep thinking.